Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. I'm approaching my 200th episode of this podcast, and I thought one thing I've never covered before is the topic of British manners. If you Google what is British culture, look at Wikipedia, or just open up TikTok, then relatively often you'll come across the idea that the Brits are well-mannered, and that's an important feature of British culture. It's a popular topic, and I would say easy at a light level. Brits say please and thank you and love to queue. Even ChatGPT can write about that, I've checked. But to be honest, it raises in my mind many other questions. Yes, British people love to say please and thank you. But other countries say it too. Americans also say please and thank you. I've met many very well-mannered Americans. In Turkish, you can say please, lütfen, and you can say thank you, teşekkürler, and that is true in many other languages. So what's the suggestion? That only Brits say please and thank you? That we say it moderately more often than other people? I'm not sure if it's always quite as well-meant or loving as it may be suggested to be. So I've been thinking about this topic a great deal, and I must admit I found it very difficult to find deep, meaningful, or just interesting writing on this topic, but I thought I'd give it my best stab. I started with, of course, the real star of the James Bond film No Time to Die, Hugh Dennis. Many Brits know Hugh Dennis, or at least they know his face from when he appeared on various topical comedy podcasts or TV shows. He also wrote a book called Britty Britty Bang Bang. I did a video on my YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/British Culture, in which I talked about my top 10 bathroom books, and his book, Britty Britty Bang Bang, was one of them. It was written shortly after the 2012 Olympics, where British pride and national identity seemed to have peaked, and the host of the Now show was writing all about what he thought was Britishness. One of the first significant chapters, there's a couple of introductory ones, was entitled Please Knock Before Entering. Well, why not have a look at his writing? Hugh Dennis. At the start of the Olympics, Transport for London placed a poster in their tube stations which was designed to encourage the thousands of foreign visitors to the capital to stand on the right of the escalators. There was a line drawing a pair of feet standing on the correct side of the moving staircase, and next to it, in very large letters, the words, "A little courtesy won't hurt you." A message suggesting that not only would our foreign visitors be standing on the wrong side, but that they would be doing it deliberately. Indeed, that before even the games had begun, they were already doing it, and that we had been pushed to the very limits of our tolerance. Did our uncivilized overseas visitors not realise that standing on the left of this essential piece of the urban transport network could hold up a hard-working London commuter for periods for as long as 30 seconds, make them late for work, and ruin the fragile British economy? And yet, in spite of such posters, Britain has a global reputation for courtesy, decorum, and its intricate system of etiquette. It is a reputation that will have been enhanced by the games themselves, and particularly by the games makers, whose willingness to help everyone and make sure they had the best possible visit to these shores was nothing short of magnificent. Whether Mandeville would have been equally impressed our overseas visitors is hard to say. Indeed, he or she, I've never been clear on how to sex a mascot, seemed determined to overturn the stereotype of British Reserve by practically assaulting the athletes as soon as they had finished their races, especially if they stood still to be interviewed, rather than using the clearer advantage an Olympic athlete will have over the mutant child of Cyclops in a toothpaste tube, namely getaway speed. Ah yes, Hugh Dennis clearly has strong views on the the London Olympics mascot, Mandeville. Courtesy stands at the centre of British life. Economists don't agree, but I suspect the reason we seem to be coming out of recession later than any of the other major industrialised nations, this being written around 2012, may simply be politeness. We are just letting the others go first. To the uninitiated, the labyrinth that is British manners seems very daunting. Foreign students, for example, worried about the culture shock of arriving in the UK and checking on the web for tips on how they should behave, are faced with a bewildering array of rules, although the websites do seem to be rather behind the times. 1. in a section entitled Manners, gives a very clear instruction on making of tea, encouraging the user to use a strainer when pouring from the pot and to refill it with hot water when the tea becomes too strong. Quite right, and a useful tip if part of your journey has involved falling through a hole in the fabric of space-time to the Britain of Formica, China and Bakelite, the 1950s. However, it is rather more complicated than it needs to be, given that Tetley introduced the tea bag to the UK in 1953. Maybe he was talking the 30s or the 40s. Likewise, there are instructions on the eating of cream tea, where instead of a simple eat it how you like it but be sure to pre-book an appointment with a cardiac unit, there are very complicated and frightening instructions on the British will expect the first-time cream tea eater. The scone, or scone, and surprisingly there are no instructions on how this should be pronounced, should first be halved with a knife horizontally, jam should be added to each half, there is no need for butter, and finally cream added on top. At this point, the two halves should be eaten separately. On no account should you put one on top of the other to make a sandwich, as that would be a dead giveaway that, frankly, you have no idea what you are doing. Stick to the instructions, however, and you will fit in seamlessly into British life, until, of course, you try to pronounce the word scone, or scone. Even eating peas gets its own section, students being told they should squash them against the reverse side of their fork, which seems a bit pointless to me. If you're going to squash them, why not cut out the middleman and go straight for the mushy ones? The etiquette of tipping is also included. It is apparently essential to press the money subtly into the tippee's hands, thereby making the most innocent of transactions look like a covert drugs deal. Students are also advised never to talk about religion or politics at the table, which sounds reasonable, except that large numbers of them will have come to the UK to study religion or politics and never to gossip about acquaintances, even if they have made a complete hash of eating a scone or scone. Surprisingly, they're also taught how to ask for the toilet, which is of course wrong. Toilet is a horrible word. In this house it is lavatory or loo, darling. We don't have a toilet or a lounge or a settee. Now pick up your serviette and start calling it a napkin. Charming as it is, all this advice is, of course it is, largely irrelevant. Unless the said students are hoping to be extras in an episode of Miss Marple, or have arranged to spend their 3 years of study living with an octogenarian spinster in a country vicarage. If they don't want to stand out as students, the advice they really need is they should rarely wash, eat only Doritos, occasionally topped by something healthy like an old chicken nugget they found down the back of the fridge, and watch every episode of Loose Women in Tracky Bottoms whilst drinking Red Bull. But then even this advice will apply only fleetingly. As soon as tuition fees kick in properly, overseas students will only fit in with their British counterparts if they too are scavenging in the woods for food and burning their own furniture to keep warm. 2012, when student fees was relatively new as an idea. Of course, all of this depends very, very heavily on the idea of British stereotypes, and stereotypes have a tendency to be behind the times. The British, of course, have many stereotypes about our nearest and dearest neighbours, France and Germany, but they tend to be pretty out of date, and further afield, it gets even more mothballed. We have relatively few stereotypes about Turks, to my experience and observation, probably due to distance, but even my ideas. I lived in Turkish Cyprus for 7 years. I try and read as much as I can in Turkish, watch Turkish films. I try and check in. Not that I do it consistently, but I try and check in as often as I can. And quite frequently I find myself in with the shock, I'm not with it anymore. Then again, I'm also not with it. Many, many Brits, and most people find that at some point in their life. It's the old Grandpa Simpson idea. I used to be with it, but what it was has changed, and now what it is weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you. Hence, books on etiquette, what to do, how to behave, they can very swiftly become out of date, and even if I were to set out my own prescription for how to behave in the UK, it could be very, very different for people of a different age, people from a different social background, and people living in a different part of the country. And manners, I think this is important, is something on which you can agree with the other person. You don't say, he's very well mannered, of someone whose fundamental behaviour you disagree with. Still, someone I agree with a great deal is, of course, my wife. My wife is from California in the United States, and she once gave me an interesting perspective on British culture that came, for me, quite out of the blue. We were watching the TV show Micheal Portillo's Great Train Journeys, or Great British Train Journeys. There's a whole series of TV shows he has on train journeys, most of which I find absolutely fantastic as a window into Britain, how it is lived, as opposed to Britain as seen from London. Micheal Portillo was on a train, an old-fashioned train, and asked the conductor, in this age of health and safety, would you mind if I put my head out of the train window? The conductor said, certainly, sir, please go ahead, and so he did. My wife was saying that surely an American wouldn't ask for permission, he'd just get up and do it, so why does Portillo do it? My answer was, because it's not his train carriage. He is respecting the conductor's right, his authority in his own domain. Equally, the conductor is recognising Portillo's place, calling him Sir, as the former, some time ago now, Minister of Defence under Margaret Thatcher. Both men are middle-aged, older even, and whilst I might not see such behaviours in the inner cities, I do see such behaviour living in my semi-rural town of just 18,000 people, from young and old people alike. One of the joys of living in a small town is, of course, the Facebook community group, and naturally you see a great number of complaints, but occasionally you do see these really lovely posts talking about the behaviour of young people in a very, very positive way, saying it brought back memories of my youth, seeing how they behave towards older gentlemen, and so on. I really like that. As I say, the relationship between a former government minister and this train conductor was very, very respectful. Micheal Portillo asking, in this age, would you mind if I put my head out of the train window? I feel that was a good window, and for me a slightly unexpected one, on British manners. I mentioned earlier, other countries do have manners. I lived in China for 6 years, and many, many Brits and Americans who came out to work in China, often for a year or two, they were pretty taken aback at some of the things that Chinese people would say to them, especially if the Chinese commented on their weight, which, where I lived, was not unusual. The local Shenzheners would often say, hey, you put on weight, or you need to put on weight, or just, you look tired. This seemed not well-mannered to many Brits and Americans, but it was perfectly normal. For them, they would say it to each other, and so it seemed part of the social contract. In fact, some Chinese people would say, you know what? It means we care about you. If we didn't care about you, we wouldn't say it. We're just demonstrating how much we cared about you. As I say, especially recent arrivals wouldn't totally be on board with that. I got very used to it. In fact, we used to have a set of scales in our sales girls' offices. There weren't many salesmen, so I call it the sales girls' office. And if I weighed myself, I was working up quite a bit, then one of the cheekier ones would just shout out my weight for absolutely everyone. I didn't mind too much, but I have to admit, I wouldn't do it for other people. Of course, it is a stark contrast to many other East Asian cultures. People talk about the importance of face in Asian culture, and it's very, very true. But again, the workings of it in China seem to be very different from how it's described in Japan. I've visited, I wouldn't say I've got a great insight there. But again, it's all things that are changing. Mainland Chinese can be famously loud in any number, and they can push on the metro for sure in Shenzhen, and for older businessmen, wealth, if acquired, is conspicuous. Gold chains, designer clothes, and so on. But even saying that, even a few years ago, that could be untrue, because it's changing. The last statement is very untrue for younger businessmen who often go for more discreet displays of wealth, and etiquette on the metro is actually evolving in many different cities very, very differently. It's fair to say, in a country of over 1 billion people, which is urbanised relatively recently, the UK being the first country to have the majority of the population living in cities, and China urbanising within living memory, customs can vary from one town or village to the next. And when I say town or village, I'm saying so with kind of inverted quotes, because a small town might be 6 million people, a village might be 2 million people. The city I lived in was probably 20 million people. The city I lived in China was also particularly unusual because people would cycle in and out. They would come for a year or two and then go. So often you had competing manners from very different parts of China. But it was all on display. Turkish manners, well, in Turkey I lived in the opposite. I lived in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Very rural at the time, very, very isolated, but one thing common throughout Turkey is that eye contact, especially man-to-man, significantly longer than it was in British society. So some Brits would say, I feel really uncomfortable there because it looks like they're staring at me. And I replied, well, they're not staring at you, they're just holding eye contact, which is a polite thing to do, and trying to shift eye contact can seem, well, just untrustworthy. So there was just a difference of eye contact, and again, villages can be very, very different. In the villages where I lived, attitudes to time differed significantly from the UK. If a Brit says I'll be there at 2 o'clock, he'll be there around about 2. In fact, we used to have parties of Brits, Germans and Turks, and one of our German guests observed the Germans arrive exactly on time, 2 o'clock, as if it was a bus taking them all. They'd all come from different parts of the island. They'd arrive at exactly the same time. The Brits, again, would arrive around about the same time, to stagger arrivals, whilst the Turks would arrive on the day, and in my experience, often the next day or several days later. It was an invitation. But again, we have different attitudes because the Industrial Revolution made such a big impact on British culture, and in Turkish Cyprus, distinct from mainland Turkey, it had not. A manner I prefer in Turkish Cyprus is the fact that when I met somebody for business, government business or whatever, we'd talk family first. It makes sense for a small place. You want to see, are we related? How are we related? But when I came to the UK for education, I found the abruptness by which business was discussed quite disconcerting. I had a teacher at university who just started to teach. No personal introduction, barely even said my name is. And I spent the whole lecture wondering, who is this person? Where did she go to school? Where did she go to university? What's her family arrangements? Does she have children? Does she have a PhD? Where did she do her PhD? And in what? And how did she come to teach at this university? I just sat through the whole thing having loads of personal questions. This was my first interaction with UK education. Ultimately, I just came to accept, Brits are, unfortunately, by one rubric, quite rude. They don't introduce themselves when they come to teach, as I was expecting, to be honest, to see their resume and their certificates, as you would in Turkish Cyprus, and I believe as you would, perhaps to a lesser extent, in modern Turkey, where a teacher would introduce themselves a bit more fully. It's the polite thing to do. Nonetheless, Brits are seen as polite all over the world. This may be an influence of costume drama. Again, I would say this is strangely popular around the world, despite focusing often on rigid class structures, which may be very, very different to international audiences. The 18th century of Britain was very, very different to the 18th century of America or China or other countries where these dramas are rarely, rarely popular. The strongest criticism I've come across of costume dramas are from UK academics. UK academics argue that costume dramas present an unduly rose-tinted view of our former sociological constructs. They lack narratives of oppression of the working class, and in many cases, these are comparable to criticisms by US historians of cowboy films, which show a very limited time in history, the real history often being quite dull, to be honest, and where towns and communities almost entirely relied on cooperation rather than rugged individualism, and in which the 10-gallon hat was almost non-existent. Most people wore the bowler, some people call it derby, and some people call it Coke hat. So you can arrange those criticisms in order of importance at your leisure. Despite these criticisms, many of my Chinese friends, and Chinese friends especially, love Downton Abbey. I've only seen one episode of it. Samantha Bond, Miss Moneypenny was really good. But this show builds the impression that English people are all polite, I think, from what I've seen of it. I can only hope that on a visit to the UK, Chinese people are not disabused of this idea. Actually, I've been very happy to guide my Chinese colleagues, my former Chinese colleagues, when visiting the UK, and they found it to be picturesque. And thankfully, they enjoyed the food, especially in Yorkshire, London, so-so, as I find it. Been trying to delve deeper into this. When did this idea of British manners start? The oldest known courtesy book from England is the Book of a Civilised Man by Daniel of Beccles, also known as the Liber Urbanae, from the beginning of the 13th century, possibly 1190 AD, although there are older examples from Italy and Germany, and focusing on British manners, in the 3rd millennium before Christ, the ancient Egyptian vizier Ptahhotep, wrote the Maxims of Ptahhotep in the year 2375 to 2350 before Christ. It's a book of precepts extolling their civic virtues such as truthfulness, self-control and kindness towards other people. So we have a history of being polite to each other. Again, not the first time on this podcast I turned to the Encyclopaedia Britannica. They had a good example on, well, at least what is a gentleman, because that seems to be a good centre for what is British manners. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, for the most part of the Middle Ages, when the basic social distinction was between nobles and the ignobles, serfs, citizens, burghers, the word gentleman was roughly equivalent to nobilis. There was, in this respect, no distinction between the great earl and the humble freeman. Even as late as 1400, the term still had only the sense of generous and could not accurately be used as a personal description denoting rank or quality, or as the title of a class. Yet, after 1413, it was increasingly so used. The list of landowners in 1431, printed in feudal age, contains, besides knights, esquires, yeomen and husbandmen, a fair number who were classed as gentlemen. The immediate cause of this was probably the statute of Henry V, Statute 1, Chapter 5, 1413, which required that in all original writs of action, personal appeals, and indictments which involved the process of outlawry, the estate, degree, or mystery of the defendant must be stated. Mystery is what's written here. I wonder if mastery was the original. More widespread influences were also at work. The profound economic changes of the 14th and 15th centuries, caused partly by the Black Death, made it increasingly difficult and unattractive for the younger sons of the nobility to settle on the land. They tended to seek their fortunes abroad in continental wars or become dependents of the court or of some great noble house. Such men often chose to describe themselves as gentlemen. Another section. In the fluid social conditions of the 16th and 17th centuries, many acquired the right to bear arms who were ignobilis. Hence the term nobleman came to be reserved for members of the peerage, whilst anyone who could afford, such as William Harrison put it in Description of England 1577, to live without manual labour, and thereto is able and will bear the port, charge and countenance of a gentleman, could for money have a coat and arms bestowed upon him by heralds, and be reputed for a gentleman ever after. It became sought after as an indication of social status. The term gentleman retained a certain value as an index of rank and affluence until the early 19th century. By 1900, under the influence of the political, economic and social changes of the Victorian era, the word had acquired a variety of usages and meanings which fully reflected the complexity of English society. On the one hand, gentleman could be a mere synonym of men, used at public places and occasions to distinguish male persons from females, and, on the other hand, acceptance by society as a gentleman still required an income derived from sources other than manual labour and retail trade. In England, this view, though much weakened by the social upheavals produced by the two world wars, and to some extent prevailed, preserved, cherished and typified in the rigid distinction on the cricket field between gentlemen and players, in general, however, the modern gentleman is well-mannered, rather than necessarily well-bred or well-off. Well, again, perhaps the highest expression is Sir Richard Steele, who in 1714, that the appellation of a gentleman is never to be affixed to a man's circumstances, but to his behaviour in them. This was kind of reflected in the popular movie Kingsman, where the top spy, Harry Hart, says, "There's nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self." He also draws upon William Horman, who was a headmaster at Eton and Winchester College in the early Tudor period of English history. William Horman lived 1440 to 1535, just to give an idea of the dates. In his book, The Vulgaria, a collection of common, hence vulgar sayings, "Manners maketh man." Harry Hart in the Kingsman movie quotes that it's your bearing, not your situation. I quite like this. Again, Harry Hart sets out being a gentleman has nothing to do with the circumstances of one's birth. Being a gentleman is something one learns. On the other hand, he also says a gentleman's name should only appear in the newspapers on 3 occasions: when he's born, when he marries, and when he dies. I must admit, in my view, the first 2 are very much an indication of social status. I don't think any newspaper reported my birth. I can't think of any newspaper reported my marriage. The one I rarely disagree with Harry Hart is when he said the suit is the modern gentleman's armour, describing the Kingsmen as the new knights. I'm not sure if I regard my suits as armour, they're just clothes, but nonetheless, I think his might have some special features. The emergence of the new middle class in the Victorian era, the 1850s, England becoming the first nation in history where the majority of people lived in cities, definitely created a discussion for how we should all live. After all, when people were in more settled communities, much smaller communities, everyone knew each other. Everyone knew their own traditions, manners, customs, stories, music. It was very hard to communicate across long distances and to standardise. In fact, there was no need for a national standard, and the logistics were tricky except at the very, very top of the church and the state. Those who travelled significantly were pretty unusual. After all, until relatively recently, the majority of those who died on military expeditions died of dysentery. Travel was more dangerous than fighting in war. It's something easily forgotten. But in the Victorian era, we suddenly saw communities that existed since time immemorial, suddenly uprooted and thrown together in claustrophobic environments. Suddenly, communities that had their own way of life, their own little customs and oddities. They were living cheek by jowl with those who were once over the hill and far away. So customs had to be agreed upon, and the new wealth also got turned up by social conventions. Capitalism, of course, found a way. You had cooking books like Mrs. Beeson's at one time. There's no need for a cooking book for the ordinary household. After all, you learned from mothers, aunts, grandmothers, and so on. But suddenly, again, being thrown into cities, disconnected from communities, you needed cooking books, and Mrs. Beeson's was the most popular. Manners books, there's a whole slew of them, and even travel books, such as the ones that Micheal Portillo uses on his TV shows as he travels around. He always has some 150-year-old travel book as he goes. These were not always disconnected, by the way. Railways meant that foods once found in one area, and which needed to remain fresh, could now be transported. Derbyshire, as an example of an inland county, can now have white fish from East Yorkshire. But how to cook it? Well, you've got Mrs. Beeson's. How to eat it politely and retain social standing? Well, you've got manners books. Is this completely alien to our own time? Again, referring to my time in Shenzhen, China, that is a city where people's lives are being changed dramatically by wealth, by technology, by changing places, and a lot of the discussions that I read about in history books in the Victorian era are happening right now in Shenzhen. Indeed, even in the West we have times of change and innovation, and this has led to a flourishing of how-to books and YouTube tutorials today. Victorian society was changing at a tremendous rate. People were looking for guides and gurus to provide some kind of certainty. And in a sense, it doesn't matter what manners and conventions actually are, as long as everyone agrees upon them. Again, we changed dramatically in the First and Second World War, but we've gradually settled. One last thing. When putting together this podcast, I didn't actually ask anybody else's opinions. I've noticed that values, opinions, ideas, and manners vary greatly, even within, say, the United States. I've talked about the differences within China, or rather noted that there are differences, but in the United States the difference between East and West are very palpable to my experience. Even within the UK, they're very, very different. So, no recommended rabbit hole this week, but I wonder, if you do have an opinion, a story to tell, something you'd like to get in touch with me, well, please do. You can contact me on Instagram at Fleming Never Dies. You can comment below if you're listening on, I think Spotify now does that, YouTube now does that. And of course you can email me, albionneverdies@gmail.com. And I hope throughout this podcast recording, I myself was polite and that you found me to be so. It wouldn't be impolite to tell me I wasn't. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.